Thank you. I'm very impressed. Thank you, Bryce. Very impressed by this group blending, a drinking club with with high intellectual content. So I will be providing some of that intellectual content. So yeah, and as I said, I don't think I've been to Ghent before that I can remember, and so it's nice to be invited. Yeah. So as I understand it, I basically am going to be just speaking through the work that I've done since the mid to early 2000s, and I was just saying this is a bit like going through my greatest hits, like a discography. So we start with the first album and then we move forward to the next album. So I'll just be covering each of my books. I'll talk a little bit more about some than about others, but I'll just try and put it all together for you. The big themes that I've addressed in my academic career and I've also written in the popular press is around three major ideas or themes. The first is to do with what I call majority ethnicity. And I'll just explain what that means because you may know what the term nation is. But what is ethnicity? Ethnicity is really a community that believes themselves to be of shared ancestry. That's what ethnicity is. It's not the same thing as nation. Nation is about territory and politics. Ethnicity is about beliefs about being descended from common ancestors, and also that is to some degree about cultural differences. Could be religion, could be physical appearance, could be language that mark out one group from another. So when I talk about ethnicity, usually most people think of ethnicity as ethnic minority groups. Groups that are different from the majority by language, by religion, maybe by physical appearance, and have a different set of collective memories about where they descend from. Chinese in Britain would have their memories going back to their ancestors, would go back to China, and they may or may not speak some Chinese. So they would be a bit different. Maybe religiously they might be Buddhist. So that's ethnicity, but I was interested in majority or dominant ethnic groups, which are much less studied. So what we studied is nations and then ethnic minorities, but what we hadn't studied as much is majority groups. And that's important because majority ethnic groups are declining in size as ethnic minorities increase through immigration or maybe through higher birth rates. The composition, the ethnic composition of countries, particularly in the West, is changing. And so this becomes more important as it's not just about, in Europe, for example, in 1900, the immigrant population of most West European countries was 1 or 2%, that's it. Switzerland a bit higher, but it's still pretty low, very low. So you could almost assume that nation was the same thing as majority ethnicity. But it's no longer possible to make that equation because there's a much larger share of ethnic minorities to the point where in North America, where I'm from, in both Canada and the US, by the middle of this century, the majority ethnic group, which would be white Canadians or white Americans, will be only around 50% or half the population. It'll start to go below that around the middle of the century, and in Europe it'll be at the end of the century. So that's going to mean that majority ethnicity or dominant ethnicity will become a more important category. And so I've been interested in white identity in the US, for example, or white Anglo-Protestant, the Anglo-Protestant majority ethnic group of the United States, which used to be the majority and fell below 50% around 1920, thereabouts. Now, what happened was the Catholics and the Protestants and the Jews kind of mixed together. And so you had an expansion into this new group called white, which then is now at about just over 60% of the US. So that's one focus. Now I'm also interested in nation as well, which is, again, that's territory and politics, not so much ancestry and culture, but they're related, and I can talk about them. Number two, so we've talked about majority ethnicity. That's one thing I'm quite interested in. I'm also interested in nation, but majority ethnicity, keep that in your mind. Number two is demography, which is about population. population shifts, population change. That could be immigration, it could be birth rate differences, could be age structure. That's demography. Demographers are generally not that exciting people. They study really, really, really narrow topics that are only of interest to a very small number of people. But what I'm interested in is how population affects culture and politics, population change. Now, of course, we can also ask questions about what affects population. Why are birth rates falling? That's a demography question. The question I'm interested in that, but I'm also interested in what happens when how does population change affect politics? If you have ethnic shifts, does that lead to violence? Does it lead to political polarization and tension, or not? That's number two. I'm interested in population change and then how that affects politics and culture. And then number three, I'm interested particularly in the liberal left, not the communist left so much. I'm interested in what's happened to liberalism, particularly as it becomes less interested in the state and more interested in, or more worried about, majorities, like ethnic majorities. So liberalism becomes more worried about oppressor majorities and less worried about state oppression. But also the left, as it shifts from worrying about class to worrying about race and gender and sexuality. So these are kind of the three areas that I look at in my work. And then I also look at how they intersect. Because actually I think these are very powerful forces and they are working and mixing in different ways. And I think that's helping to define some of the problems that I'm interested in. Okay, let us now, are we going to, every time it's, hang on, here we go. All right. Okay, first book. Initially, by the way, the publishers, they sent me the cover for this book. This is my first book, and it was with Harvard University Press. So it was very important as an academic to get a book published with Harvard University Press. So I wasn't going to argue, but they sent me the cover, and it was a picture of a man patting a dog. And they wanted that to be the cover for my book. So I rejected that. I said, no, I don't want to have a picture of a man patting a dog. So they said, oh, well, if you don't take that, then you have to take this very boring cover. So I said, okay. This came out in 2004, Rise and Fall of Anglo-America. It's about the decline of dominant ethnicity in the United States, the decline of the Anglo-Protestant ethnic majority in the US as a result of immigration for the most part. But not just immigration, but I was interested in this question. And partly in the context of, Europe and the West is going through these demographic shifts. And I wanted to say, well, if we go back to an earlier time, maybe 100 years ago or less than 100 years ago, we can see something similar occurring. And I was interested to see how this was handled in the US case, historically. So it's more of a book of historical sociology or political history, and there isn't so much statistical survey stuff, which I brought in more in my recent work. So what is the argument essentially here? The argument here is that left liberalism I talked about really holds the key to understanding the decline of the WASP, or white Anglo-Protestant ethnic majority of the United States. And some of those left liberal movements are incredibly important. So I want to talk about those left liberal movements. And so this is just an outline of the chapters of that book, The Rise and Fall of Anglo-America. And what I first do is talk about the fact that the United States, people say a nation of immigrants, but actually, in many ways, the US was more similar to European countries. So for example, at the time of American independence, the free population, you had 20% slaves or slave origin black Americans, but of the white population, it was 98% Protestant at the time of the American Revolution. So very little religious diversity, very few Catholics. Sorry to disappoint people here. So 98% Protestant, and 80% of the population was descended from British. When I say British, I mean English, Scottish, Scotch-Irish was 80%. And then of the other 20, it was, Dutch, some French, a little bit of German. That's basically it. And they more or less assimilated with the British stock to become one group, more or less. So you have like assimilation. I don't know if any of you have heard of Paul Revere, the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere in the American Revolution. Paul Revere, that comes from a Huguenot named Rivoire, which is changed to Revere. That's an example of this assimilation that had occurred even amongst people of French, Dutch, etc. Background. So you had this ethnic majority group in the US at the time of the Revolution, and then there was very little immigration from other sources until we get to the Irish famine in the 1840s, and then you get a million or over a million Irish people showing up within a very short space of time, a number of years, mostly Catholics. And then what happens is you get a reaction, a sort of what you might call a populist right, similar to what we see maybe in the West today. This was called the American Party, which you may have heard the term Know Nothing, the Know Nothing Party, this was their secret symbols that they had. It's why they were called the Know Nothings. This has been the most successful third party movement in American history. Some had said they would have won the American presidency if it wasn't for the Civil War of 1860, which split the wings of the Know Nothing Party into the North and the South, the pro-slavery, anti-slavery wings. But it just shows you the power of this politics, even going back to the 1850s. The politics we're seeing now, we saw that kind of politics in the US in the 1850s. Okay, but then what happens is you start to see the emergence of liberalism. So liberalism in the 19th century, the United States, believed in the idea of the US as sort of a providential nation, and God had a plan. The US was the highest in God's view, and therefore you didn't want to interfere with God's plan. If the plan was that everybody was gathering, the peoples of the earth were gathering into the US through immigration, that was God's plan. You didn't want to interfere with it. That was part of this liberal outlook. But that liberal outlook was not very egalitarian. They didn't believe in redistribution of wealth. They didn't particularly care that much about black Americans, for example. But it was just this very religious kind of providential, you can't interfere with God's plan idea. And they were very concerned about, and you would get people who would say, US is a nation of immigrants, all the peoples of the world, in one breath, and then in the next breath they would say, we are the purer Anglo-Saxons than the English. And the same person would say both of those things within roughly the same year. Someone like Ralph Waldo Emerson, you may or may not have heard of some of these American writers. They were really talking about the US as this brand new society, and then in the next breath, no, we are more Anglo-Saxon than the Anglo-Saxons. And they wanted to have their cake and eat it as well. And they sort of felt, okay, so these Irish Catholics will come in, but they will eventually become Protestants, and they will eventually become Anglo-Saxons. That was roughly to the extent they thought about it, that was the idea. Now, that didn't happen. You started to get the Catholic Church expanding, and at some point, there was a realization late in the 19th century, around the mid-1880s, that you weren't going to get the Catholics just assimilating and becoming Protestants. And all of a sudden, more people started to get worried. And then you actually it was the left. To the extent we can talk about right and left back then, it was the people who were worried about the workers and about reforming conditions in the cities, because the cities were expanding at this time. US was still a rural country, mostly. Most of the population lived on farms. as you got the cities expanding, you started to get immigration into the cities, mainly from, well, Irish, German, and then later as we get towards the 1890s and early part of the 20th century, Southern and Eastern Europe started to come in. Italians, Poles, Russian Jews, and others. It was the left who said, we're really concerned about poverty and inequality, and we're also really concerned about immigration. It's an evil. And we're really concerned about drinking. That's an evil. And so some of the things we might consider right-wing, like restricting immigration, prohibiting alcohol, some of these sorts of things which we would consider on the right were linked to attitudes that we would consider on the left, like redistributing wealth, addressing poverty. So that was what was called the progressive movement. Progressive in the year 1890 meant what I just said, immigration restriction, banning alcohol. Now, women's voting was part of that. Immigration was seen as a threat to women's voting. It was seen as a setting back women's voting. And also, cities were seen as sinful in some way. So that was kind of the outlook of that period. You had these people who were very much about God's plan. We can't interfere with, if God plans inequality, then we have to have inequality. If God's plan is large-scale immigration, we have to have large-scale immigration. These progressives said, no, that's a terrible idea. We need to restrict. And that was the beginning of the restrictionist movement. 1882, there was a cutoff of Chinese. The Chinese had started to work on the railroad in California. Chinese immigration was banned in 1882. That was the beginning of this. And it was a mix of unions and workers with these progressive, Victorian progressives who were very much about what you might call social reform, social gospel. So that politics is very different from what we have now. Now, as we move into the 20th century, we start to see a politics which is more similar to something we might recognize. So you have the first group of people who were both liberal in that they believed in large-scale immigration, cosmopolitanism, and they were also believers in equality, so addressing the ills of inequality and poverty and so on. They are really the ancestors of present-day liberals. So these were people we call the liberal progressives, John Dewey, Jane Addams, and they were engaged in social reform activities to help the poor, but they were also very much in favor of liberal immigration. They were against things like prohibition, prohibition was linked to the Protestant majority who essentially wanted to put Catholics in their place by not allowing them to drink. That was roughly the politics. So that was kind of the liberal progressives. Now, there were some interesting things happening. So one is they were trying to say the US shouldn't just be about New England and the Anglo-Saxons. It actually should be an international cosmopolitan nation, not just the Anglo-Saxon stock. So that was one of the things that they talked about, which was quite distinctive. And they influenced the Protestant clergymen. Coming in the, talked about in the 1890s. The first bill was in the 1910s. By 1924, the new bill said the immigration flow has to essentially, the nationality of the immigrants coming in has to reflect the share of the composition, the share of the population that each group makes up in the US. So Britain got half of the immigration quota for the United States because they said, well, roughly half of the population of the US is of British ancestry, whereas Italy got a very small quota because that was only a small part of the American population, even though a lot of the demand to come to the US was coming from places like Italy. So the immigration flow from those countries like Italy and Poland was really choked off to a very large extent by the 1924 laws. And that was opposed by the liberal progressives and by these ecumenical Protestant clergymen of the Federal Council of Churches these are people who were very influential with the elite. They knew a lot of Wall Street financiers. They knew a lot of the politicians in Washington. In terms of the cultural elite, they were influential. But that didn't mean that it changed American politics. American politics was still driven by the voters who wanted immigration restriction, and so these people could talk about cosmopolitanism and opening up immigration, but they lost. These kind of the new left liberals lost the political battles, and the restrictionists won the political battles. Now, it's also important to talk about the origin of when you talk about wokeness and we talk about political correctness and some of the movements that we are living through now, you can see the first beginnings of that in the work of these intellectuals. Because the United States let's say take a year, 1900 or 1910, the East Coast cities like Chicago, New York were already majority non-Protestant. They were majority immigrant origin. So these big East Coast cities were majority foreign stock, is the term that was used, already. And in that environment, these intellectuals said, wow, this is the model for a new international society, and we want to create a new international nation, and we want to get away from that old Anglo-Protestant conception of America. The New York modernists, the people like Randolph Bourne, the Greenwich Village bohemians of the 1910s, they were experimenting with drugs. They were going to the black neighborhoods to see jazz. That was all very new. They were interested in modern art. And they were much more aggressively anti-WASP. So they would say, well, the Anglo-Protestants are boring, they're repressed, they don't like to drink. I mean, some of this stuff was true, by the way. But, so they kind of mentioned this as a critique of their own group, because they themselves were mainly from New England Protestant backgrounds. But why that's important is because people like Randolph Bourne and these bohemians were actually saying, we don't like ethnicity if it's about the majority, but the ethnic minorities, that's really good that they have ethnicity. They shouldn't assimilate, they should keep their traditions, and if they do assimilate, we don't like that. We're going to call them cultural half-breeds. So that was the term for white ethnic minorities that assimilated were called cultural half-breeds, and they didn't want that. So they wanted the minorities to keep their culture, keep apart, but they wanted the majorities to forget their culture. And I think that's very important. If we think about today, the attitude of particularly progressives is ethnic majorities should forget about their traditions, should forget about their heritage and be cosmopolitan. Ethnic minorities should cling to their heritage and retain their heritage and not assimilate. So it's not a consistent attitude on ethnicity. It just depends if you're talking about majority or minority. And the term I kind of coined for that outlook is asymmetrical multiculturalism. So an asymmetry in your views of ethnicity. For a majority, it's terrible. For minorities, it's great. Okay, so that attitude begins in the 1910s. The earliest versions of multiculturalism were formulated around 1916 by Randolph Bourne and his circle. So multiculturalism's origins, I would argue, are not with Otto Bauer and Karl Renner and all of these Austro-Hungarians, which all that was about managing an empire. This was much more radical. This was much more about explaining how we get to where we are today. These immigrant groups, their culture is very exciting and interesting and great, and the majority group culture is boring and repressive and it's terrible. That outlook is still with us. And so I think it begins in this period of the 1910s, which then influences the generation of the 1920s. Of course, they're living under prohibition of alcohol, which is in place between 1920 and 1933. You couldn't buy or sell alcohol in the United States. This was the time of Al Capone and the mafia. Of course, they were supplying the alcohol. But in the 1920s, then, you had the population had voted for prohibition of alcohol, but there was a growing rebellion against that prohibition from both the Catholic and Jewish minorities, but also the upper class Anglo-Protestant Wall Street, the upper class group starts to rebel, and they join forces with the immigrant groups to try and overthrow, and eventually they defeat prohibition. But that's an example of where you have this coalition between the elite, a certain kind of elite, and minorities coming together. And we're seeing that coalition also now. So it's kind of relevant for what's happening now. And then I moved to talk about the decline of Anglo-Protestants, and of course this is happening through migration. It's also happening because assimilation starts to falter and the emphasis on assimilation starts to wane. These people had lost the battles in the 1910s and 20s, but eventually they won. So the left liberals had lost, but eventually by the time we roll around to the 1950s, moving into the 60s, they were having more influence. The universities were starting to expand a little bit. And so eventually that outlook, that pluralist outlook of the liberal progressives and the New York Village modernists starts to expand and become more influential. It's not until the 1960s that outlook actually breaks through into the media. The media, if you look at the content, for example, was very much in favor of immigration restriction right up until the 1960s. The unions were anti-immigration right up until the 1960s. And then there's this sudden change as the intellectual left eventually starts to make headway and break into the media, break into the top layers of the unions. Then you're starting to get a shift, and eventually the Democratic Party as well. For example, under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the New Deal from the 1930s and 40s, for example, the US had been very restrictionist on immigration, even with regard to, for example, Jewish refugees from Europe. They were quite restrictionist as well. And in the 1950s, they actually had another battle, and Harry Truman was trying to get the immigration laws liberalized so that they would be essentially not preferring Britain and Northwestern Europe. He failed and was defeated in the early 1950s. But as we get into the later 1950s, there were exceptions that the liberal side was able to get an exception for the Cuban refugees and the Hungarian refugees because they were fighting communism. And then in 1965, the immigration laws are completely changed, and all of a sudden there's this big increase in immigration from non-traditional sources. And that's the beginning of a real major shift in the US, the big rise in the Latino population. So in the 1950s, you had a lot of Latino farm workers that were in the US illegally. There was a mass deportation of several million to Mexico called Operation Wetback in the 1950s. That was the last time you had one of these major deportations. And so the culture has shifted in the 1960s, become much more liberal. And that's sort of behind the more liberalized immigration laws, which then allows for the demographic shift to take place. Now, just getting to the conclusion, one of the things I was thinking about and other people were thinking about is, in the 1990s and the early 2000s, we had a few populist movements. We had, in California, there was a vote which went, I think, 59%, almost 60% of people voted for something called Proposition 187, which is sort of a proposition which would deny public services to illegal immigrants. And all of the state of California, the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, they were all opposed to this proposition. But it won. It won despite the opposition of all of the elites of both parties. It won 60 to 40, roughly. And that was one of the reasons why Arnold Schwarzenegger was able to get into power as governor of California, by the way, on the back of that. So that was kind of one thing. And then you had Pat Buchanan, who was a early version of Trump in some ways. Pat Buchanan was a former advisor to Richard Nixon. He was a journalist. And of course, the media was not as, let's just say people weren't canceled as easily. So he was actually on a CNN program called Crossfire for many years. And, he had his political campaigns. It wasn't toxic in the way it would become later. But Buchanan actually did very well in the Republican primary in 1992 and 1996. He almost became the leader of the Republican Party. And one of his platforms was really cracking down on the border. So he didn't get there, but one of the questions we were asking was, it's very surprising that the US hasn't had a major populist figure on the immigration issue. That's just really surprising. We can't really understand why that's happening. Of course, it happened about 15 years later with Donald Trump. So that was the 2004 book, The Rise and Fall of Anglo-America. I'm not going to talk much about this book. This is just a collection of essays by different authors about this theme of ethnic majorities. I mentioned that was one of the three themes that I'm talking about, majority ethnic groups and dominant minority groups. So that's something that I then got a collection of authors to look at in more depth. How do these groups operate? What challenges have they faced? I mean, sometimes groups are just left over from empires that crumble, and they happen to be the dominant group left over after the empire crumbles. Anyhow, that's just, I'm not going to talk much about this book, but it's developing that theme of ethnic majorities that I'd dealt with in the book, The Rise and Fall of Anglo-America. So I'm kind of very much interested in ethnic majorities and how they deal with demographic shifts and immigration pressures, and then how the left tries to sort of generally liberalize immigration. When I say the left, I mean the liberal left. So, because again, I do want to stress that in the 19th century, the left was relatively immigration restrictionist. And even the Marxist left, Marxists believed, up until I'd say World War I, Marxists tended to believe that immigration would hold back the revolution, the socialist revolution, because you're getting people from more backward countries according to the socialist schema. You have countries and they have to move through these stages. They have to get to the capitalist stage before they can get to the socialist stage. So if you bring in too many people that are from the peasant stage, they're going to hold back the revolution. And so actually, a lot of Marxists were immigration restrictionists as well. And they were also nationalistic. Very interesting. And it's not till we get to the 1930s, perhaps, that we start to see a change. Okay, I'm now going to just move over to record number 3 and 4, which is my work on the Orange Order. Now, the orange bit in the Orange Order actually has a connection to the Netherlands. I'm trying to connect this. I know this isn't the Netherlands, but it's next door. Yeah, okay, all right. Okay, so, what's known as King Billy, William of Orange, the House of Orange in the Netherlands, in the Wars of Religion, he brought an army over to and landed in Northern Ireland and in Britain as well, and played a key part in the victory of Protestantism in Britain. And in Northern Ireland in particular, a number of these battles that were fought, 4 major battles in the late 17th century, are kind of sacralized and memorialized by this Protestant fraternity called the Orange Order, which is based on a similar symbolism to the Masonic Lodge. It's very similar to the Masons. It has Grand Masters and it has a lodge structure. 10 out of its 11 symbols are the same as the Freemasons. And of course the Freemasons are also, to some extent, sometimes the Catholic Church has been very opposed to Freemasonry. So there's some association between Freemasonry and Protestantism, but that's sort of the origins of the Orange Order, and they're commemorating these battles, and particularly July 12th is their major parade. Now, it begins in Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland was 2/3 Protestant and 1/3 Catholic, 2/3 Protestants of British descent who settled there from the early 1600s, and 1/3 native Irish Catholic descent. It's now more like 50-50 due to higher Catholic birth rates. Used to be higher Catholic birth rates, and so that's that's a demographic shift affecting an ethnic majority. That was one of the reasons I was interested. Was you have an ethnic majority, the Ulster Protestants made up 2/3 of Northern Ireland, but they were declining, and they were worried about declining because they were rigging the voting system so they could stay in power in Northern Ireland. They were in power, they won every election for 50 years. Now, of course, you can imagine that everybody's voting on their ethnic lines. The Protestants voted for the Unionist Party, the Catholics voted for the Nationalist Party. The Nationalist Party lost every election for 50 years. You can imagine that probably didn't make the Nationalists feel too good. So the question really there is, the Orange Order was very worried about their declining share of the population. And they ultimately banded together as a way of trying to organize and prevent, influence politics in Northern Ireland. They hoped the Catholics would emigrate so that they wouldn't actually make up a larger share, but that's not what happened. But I was interested in this partly also because the Orange Order went to Canada, where I'm from, and in Canada we're never taught about the Orange Order, but they were actually the first Prime Minister of Canada and several Prime Ministers were Orangemen, and Toronto was a city that was run by the Orange Order between the 1870s and the 1950s. Every mayor, police chief, everything was run by them. And so I was just very interested about this whole bit of Canadian history that had never been touched. So that was kind of, but it ties in with my interest in ethnic majorities and population shifts. And then also this question of how the Orange Order managed the new liberalism starting in the sort of 1960s. And what's interesting about the Orange Order is they're able to reproduce their traditions, have their rituals, teach their history, even though the mainstream media in the province is quite hostile to them. They've been able to kind of insulate themselves and reproduce their traditions. So that's actually quite an interesting model, because in other parts of the West, those traditions have died out, those conservative historical traditions. And the past very much lives in the present there, in a way it doesn't in other parts of Britain. All right, so moving swiftly along, that's a view outside my new office window at the University of Buckingham. Nice British weather there. And you've got this is like a little poster, and it says here, a book to send Richard Dawkins onto antidepressants. It says this. So that was the review from the Sunday Times. And I got a nice little write-up from John Gray, who's a great guy. Shall the religious, this is a little bit of a U-turn, not a U-turn, but a side turn from some of the themes that I dealt with in the first book and also in the Orange Order book. And this isn't so much about one ethnic group against another ethnic group. It's much more about a question about liberalism. Because a lot of what was talked about at this time was the new atheism. Richard Dawkins and a number of other people were writing important books at the time. Francis Fukuyama had written his book, The End of History, in the mid-1990s, I think, or early 1990s. Globalization was talked about. And I was kind of interested in this question of, well, have the secularization theorists thought about what population shifts are doing to the world's religious picture and into the religious picture in particular countries? Essentially, the argument is, to put it crudely, that population change tends to increase religiosity. Mainly because religious people have higher birth rates than secular people, but also because very strict religious groups, the ultra-Orthodox Jews of Israel are one group, like the Amish are another group like that in the United States. Even in the Netherlands, there are the Orthodox Calvinists, for example. So you have groups that are sort of more strictly religious. They tend to have higher birth rates, and they tend to keep the kids in the religious community. And so you have high birth rates with retention. And that leads to very fast growth, generation after generation. So the Amish in the US have a doubling time of 25 years. There was maybe 5,000 Amish in 1900. There are hundreds of thousands today. If they continue the way they are going, in the 2200s, there will be 350 million Amish in America. So, now, they've been doing that for 100 years. They may not do, I mean, there may be something that stops them doing that for the next 100 years, but if nothing does stop them doing that, then that's going to be massive. And the Mormons, for example, are a much larger group. For a long time, the Mormons have had roughly one child more than the average American. And that has allowed them to become the majority in the state of Utah. Because there's been people moving into Utah from other parts of the United States, but those newcomers have never managed to counteract the high Mormon birth rate. Now, that high Mormon birth rate may be coming down. That's another story. But the Mormons were always a little different because they always tried to get new people to join them. Whereas the Amish and the ultra-Orthodox, their model is we're going to shut ourselves off from the world, keep the modern world away, and we'll grow our own. And actually, that's the most successful way to expand as a religious group in a modern liberal society. Whereas once you start proselytizing and trying to get converts, you're then opening yourself up to modern society, which means probably those modern forces are going to lead you eventually to start to converge and secularize and have lower birth rates. So I was very much interested in this question of population change and how it affects the size of religious groups. And then there's really kind of two mechanisms for this, and I might illustrate that in a set of these graphs. So this is a map of the world today with total fertility rate, the number of children a woman is predicted to bear in her lifetime. So anything that is blue is what's called below replacement. That is, you're having fewer children than are necessary to replace the population. And you can see that that's essentially the West, here, Europe and North America, plus East Asia, and now increasingly South America, the more European parts of South America, but increasingly other parts of the world as well. And so we have this pattern, and the lowest birth rates are generally in East Asia, Southern Europe, to some degree Eastern Europe. And then we've got this question about religiosity. Which are the most religious parts of the world, and which are the least religious? So the blue areas are the least religious parts of the world, and again, that's the same, roughly the same kinds of areas that have the lowest birth rates. So that's the West plus East Asia. The gray is sort of also relatively low religiosity, not as low as the blue. So there, just to pop back, these are the fertility rates, and these are the religiosity rates. Okay. So what's happening there is you've got this belt, which is the religious belt, the global south, we'll call it the global south, where this is all the world's population increase is happening in here, like 98%. It's all happening there, and that's the religious part of the world where roughly 95% of people are religious. So the babies being born are being born in the religious parts of the world. The non-religious parts of the world are having very few children. Okay, and what does that mean? Now, there's a couple of things going on here. One is the non-religious parts of the world are also generally the wealthier, more economic developed parts of the world. So you could say, well, this is just because these are wealthy parts of the world, and that's why you have both low religion and low fertility rates. And there's a lot of truth to that. There's a lot more women's education in these parts of the world, so you get lower birth rates. But what's really happening is there's two things happening. One is the parts of the world that happened to be poor and therefore are both religious and have high birth rates is here. So you're getting an indirect effect whereby places that have less education and less wealth are producing more children and more population. And of course, this is where the immigrants are coming from, and they're going to these parts of the world. So you're getting religious immigrants going into non-religious or less religious environments. So it's not just ethnic change, it's also the return of religion on the backs of immigrants. And just to show you an example of that, London, because Britain is one of the three countries that collects a census, does a census and asks you what your religion is. There's only a few countries that do that. Switzerland, Austria, Ireland, Britain. So Britain asked this question, and what we can see is that London is actually probably the most religious part of the United Kingdom. And Paris is one of probably the most religious parts of France. Why? Because this is where all the immigrants are going. Even most of the churches in London, it's 2/3 immigrant origin in the churches. Christianity is actually doing better in London than in the rest of Britain because it's got the African Pentecostalists, it's got people, some Asian countries as well. So immigration is a force that is increasing religion, whereas without immigration, actually religion would be declining relatively quickly. And we know that from the British census because if you look at the white British population, the proportion that say they are Christian as opposed to no religion has dropped sort of over 30%, by over 30 points just since the 2001 census. So we've had a big drop in religious identification amongst the sort of native host British population, but we've had immigration from religious parts of the world and also higher birth rates as well. And that's the sort of second part of the book, is really about how there's a connection between strong religiosity and higher birth rates. There's no better place to see this than amongst the world's Jews, because you have really two Jewish populations. You have this is an age structure pyramid. Demographers love these. So this is ages from 0 to 4 up to 90. This is getting older up here. This is men and women. Now what this shape tells us is there's a lot of young people in this population. A lot of people are under age 20, and there's very few older people. And that is the ultra-Orthodox Jewish population. This is near Manchester. There's a place called Salford, which has an ultra-Orthodox Jewish population. This is what their age pyramid looks like. But then you take, roughly 80% of the Jewish population of Britain looks like this. A lot of old people, really low birth rates, and also a lot of outmarriage. It's a very old population, actually. Fewer young people than old people. Now, you put those two things together, what it means is that the Jewish population is going to look more like these people and a lot less like these people. And in fact, the projections show that by the year 2050, the ultra-Orthodox Jews are going to be the majority, coming from a place where they're basically, they were 10% a few years ago. They're going to be over 50. In Israel, it's going to take longer, but they will also become the majority there too. The school system, the Jewish schools in Israel were like a few percentage point ultra-Orthodox in 1960. It was about a third ultra-Orthodox in the mid-2000s to about 2010. So you'll see it in the schools first, and they're going to become the majority of school children maybe in 20, 30 years. And then they'll be the majority of the voters. Now, it's a problem because they don't serve in the military, they don't work anywhere to the same extent as the other Jews. So this is going to cause probably a real crisis in Israel. It's also had implications for what's going on there now, but I won't go into that detail now. But the point here is that demographics, population shifts to do with fertility or migration can have a big impact on politics. This is the proportion. Now, this is putting together Israeli Arabs who actually don't have that high a fertility rate, but in the ultra-Orthodox as the share of primary school children. Combining these two groups, you can see between 1960 and 2005 what's been happening. And these are really monumental shifts. So population change really, and it's not obvious how this is going to change because the ultra-Orthodox believe that men should be, they shouldn't work, that they shouldn't have women can work, but they shouldn't have careers. They should basically live to study Torah. That's basically what a man should do, and women should have large families because every child is a gift from God. The more children you have, the more favored you are by God. And so you get women who can't have many children sort of thinking, oh my God, I'm not chosen by God. And it's also about sort of repopulating because they were decimated in the Holocaust. But there's a whole theology which essentially is pro-natalist, believes in having large families. And so it's now the case, by the way, that the Arab fertility, the Muslim fertility rate used to be a lot higher than the Jews in Israel, but it's now the case the Jews have higher fertility than the Muslims in Israel. And that's on the back of the growth of not just the ultra-Orthodox, but even the modern Orthodox have quite high birth rates, 3 to 4 children per woman. So Israel, as a kind of relatively modern Western country, has a very high birth rate and certainly not facing anything like the kinds of low birth rates that the rest of the world West has. It's interesting to note, however, that Jews, again, the Jews who are not ultra-Orthodox have very low birth rates. So in the United States, for example, American Jews, it's like 1.3, 1.4, really low birth rates. But the religious, the very strongly religious, have high birth rates. Well, we don't see anything quite that extreme in other Western countries, but we do see the same kind of pattern. So this is the vote for the Republican George W. Bush, who was backed by the Christian right. And this is the total fertility rate, essentially a measure of the number of children the average woman has amongst white Americans, and going from 1.6 to 2.4. And this is the vote for George W. Bush's Republicans in 2004. Utah, which is the Mormon-dominated state, has a 2.4 or 2.5 fertility rate and a 70% vote for George W. Bush. You then get a bunch of the southern states that are mainly white evangelical, Texas, Kansas, Oklahoma, etc., Mississippi, Georgia, which have and so they will have a reasonably high birth rate and reasonably high vote for Bush. And then you get down to the New England states, which have the lowest birth rates and the lowest proportion for Bush. The point here is that there's a link between what's happening to birth rates and what's happening in politics. So where you're getting more births to evangelical Protestant women who happen to live in southern states plus Utah, those are the states that are going to have a higher Republican vote, whereas the more secular, liberal, less religious states are going to have a lower Republican vote and more of a vote for the Democrats. I mean, it's a similar kind of pattern. It's not as extreme, but it's the case also in the US that the evangelical and the conservative Protestants have a higher birth rate than those who have no religion. It's quite a significant gap. The only question is going to be how much are the children of the evangelicals going to remain Christian, or how much are they going to maybe go to university and become secular liberal Democrats. And it's all about the demography would push the US in a conservative direction. It's worth saying, by the way, that 3/4 of the increase, so I'll just give you a stat here. In the 20th century, the share of white Protestants that came from conservative denominations increased from about just under 40% to about 2/3. So you had this big increase in the share of white Protestants that belonged to the conservative denominations like Southern Baptist, for example, or Pentecostalists. So those groups grew, and the Episcopalians and Northern Baptists and other mainline, more liberal sects declined. 3/4 of that shift was demographic, because the conservative Protestants had about a one-child advantage, and they maintained that one-child advantage. So more children means more mothers, means more children, so you're getting an increase. It can really compound very quickly. And that is what led to this big change, an increase in the evangelicals, and then that's what allowed Ronald Reagan and the moral majority on the back of that to start winning elections. So this is to say that these demographic shifts around religion are quite important for politics. Something similar in the Muslim world, by the way, where it was the people coming in from the countryside into the relatively secular cities like Istanbul, Algiers, Cairo. It's from these countryside with the higher birth rates, more religious. They came in, and they were a key force in the rise of Islamism. And so demography and population shifts are quite important in this story. I'm not going to say too much more about that or this book, which is more, again, just a general reader around the politics of population shifts more generally. because there's many different ways in which population change affect politics. They can affect it within a country, but they can also affect the balance of power, let's say, between, the Muslim world and the Christian world, or between the West and the East. So there are many different factors here. So Ethiopia will be a bigger country than Russia by population, if it isn't already a bigger country than Russia. I mean, Nigeria, the projections for Nigeria will be like a China in 50 years. I mean, in terms of population. The size of some of the growing countries, particularly in Africa, is going to rival a lot of the great powers today. So that can actually affect international relations as well. All right, I'm going to just sort of fast forward a little bit and get to this, my last book, White Shift, and then I'm also going to talk about my next book, Taboo. So White Shift, this is sort of now returning to some degree to the themes that I talked about in that first book, The Rise and Fall of Anglo-America, except The Rise and Fall of Anglo-America was really about the history of the United States and what happened in the 19th and early to mid 20th century, moving forward to maybe the 1960s and 70s. And I do kind of do a compressed version of that story in one of the chapters in White Shift, but mainly what this is about is the populist moment post-2014, the recent period. The rise of national populism in the West and where it comes from. So the argument that I'm making is this is very much about demographic change. And immigration is important because it is an indicator and a symbol of demographic change, the decline of ethnic majorities, whether that be white Americans in the US, whether that be white British in Britain, ethnic Dutch people in the Netherlands. That's what I'm talking about when I talk about the decline of ethnic majorities in the West, and that being the catalyst for the rise of these parties. Now, it's not the only reason, because a lot of other things are going on at the same time. But I'll just give you a sense of the demography in a second here. And so if we look at 4 Anglo countries, US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and what I've done is I've taken 1965 and 2050 as the bookends for this demographic projections. And demography, by the way, is the most predictable of the social science. If you ask me to predict what the economy is going to do, what the elections are going to be 10 years, 20 years down the road, there's a lot of guesswork. It's not a very precise science. But if you ask us to predict the composition of the population of a country, we can be a lot more precise because the 50-somethings 50 years from now have already been born, so we already know their ethnic composition, for example, and we just can run that forward in demographic models. Now, of course, we could have large-scale immigration, we could large-scale emigration, or a big die-off of population, so it's not impossible that there could be a change, but basically demography is very predictive. And so if we run these models, we can see really what's likely to happen in terms of, in ethnocultural terms, in these 4 countries. So if we take the US case first, about 85% of the United States was what's called non-Hispanic white in 1960, so of European origins in 1960. And it goes from 85% to, this was 2017, about 62%. So there's been a significant drop of 20 points between 1965 and 2017. But just looking at, if you just look at the under 5 population of the US, it's already majority minority, or it's about 50-50. So we already can project, okay, if we move ahead to 2050, that under 5 population is going to be the average voter. And so we're going to be around 50% in the United States, 50% white, from a position of 85% white. Now, there's a whole debate about Hispanics and whether they're white or not and to what extent they will assimilate. And I think probably that's right. They are likely to assimilate and to some degree to become white. But just putting that aside for the moment, because that's a complicated topic, that's a major change that we've seen in the largest Western country. Canada, I think, is an interesting case. You know, in 1965, you wouldn't know this from the history that's taught in schools, but basically almost everybody, except for the indigenous population, several percent, everybody was white in Canada and in Australia in 1965. But with rapid immigration and ethnic shifting, non-traditional sources, by the time we get to 2017, it's about 77% white in Canada, down from about 98. So that's that's about 20-point shift. And then the projections are that by 2050, Canada will have caught up with the US because it's got much higher immigration. The foreign-born share in Canada and Australia is like 22, 23% compared to 13, 14% in the US. And so it will be catching up. Australia, I think, also very, very high immigration. New Zealand, very high immigration. Are all actually, Australia at this point had not, it was still about 90% white, but that's changed very dramatically in the last 10 years. And so the trend by the 2050 is we're going to have a number of countries. Most of these countries are going to be around 50% white and from a position where they were pretty much 85, 90, 95, 90, even 99% white in 1965. So big, big shift. In Europe, that's going to be a bit more delayed, but not that much more delayed, and it depends on your assumptions around immigration levels. This is just England and Wales, a projection that I did with a demographer. The 50% point is kind of like at the end of the century. But that assumed the birth rates that obtained at the time. We were using the 2011 census numbers, and the birth rate in England and Wales was actually reasonably high. It was like around 1.9 or 1.8. It was relatively high. It's dropped substantially in the last 3-4 years, 5 years. It's now about 1.5. So it's really gone down, and that's just going to bring all of these curves down. And these are just different immigration levels, 350 a year. That's the most we thought was likely. Britain's just had around 700,000 immigrants, net migrants. So these probably will have to be revised. Depending on where the immigration numbers are, that will speed up the flow. But if we're talking about long-term, birth rates are more important in the long run. Birth rate differences between groups are more important in driving this in the long run. Immigration is much more important in the short run. Okay, so that's just a little bit of demographics for you, a little demographic background. And I think actually this is the picture that underlies the rise of the populist right. So when we do, for example, you can do psychological research where you ask people, okay, think about the US becoming majority non-white in 2050, and then answer these questions. And so when you do that kind of an experiment, you actually see people's support for the populist right, for Donald Trump, for everything rises, just from reading that paragraph. Or in Britain, I've done a study where we said, well, do you want to have more immigration, but it's going to be higher skill? You're going to get better people in a way. They're going to have higher skilled, or less immigration, but they're going to be lower skilled. That was the choice that we gave people, and people were about 50-50 between those two. But then when you said, okay, well, we're going to have higher immigration with higher skill, but it's going to lead to a bigger change in the ethnic composition of the population. So that with the higher skilled, higher immigration option, Britain is only going to be 58% white British in 2060, whereas the lower immigration, it'll be 65. All of a sudden, it went from 50-50 to 75-25, this massive change. And I think that's sort of pinpointing a lot of some of the anxieties that are driving this. Now, in addition to that, if we look at the large-scale voting and survey data, one of the things you notice is whether a person is rich or poor, whether they've lost their job or not, it makes hardly any difference to whether they're going to vote for Trump, for Brexit, for a populist right party. It doesn't make much difference. Their socioeconomic status, the economic side doesn't really do much. What really counts is their psychological attitudes. So, for example, if you say yes to this question. British culture was better in the past. Or I could say, Flemish culture was better in the past. I mean, if you agree with that statement, you are much more likely to be a populist right voter, whereas whether you're rich or poor makes almost no difference. Even a question like, do you support the death penalty is much more informative than a question about your income. And so one of the conclusions really is then that support for populist right parties is driven mainly by cultural and psychological attitudes and not by personal economic circumstances. Economic circumstances don't make much difference. Another way we can see that is we had an economic crisis in 2007-8. That made no difference to support for the populist right across the West. Zero difference on average. The migrant crisis 2015-16 made a massive difference in almost every country. There were a few exceptions because there's always a certain amount of up and down to do with, if there's one coalition in power, another coalition in power, a charismatic leader falls away, there's a no new leader. So there are all these kind of short-term factors that can knock a party's support up and down, but behind it all are these cultural demographic factors. So the AfD in Bavaria, there was a survey done. The question asked was, is Germany losing its culture? 100%. 100% of AfD voters said yes to that question, as opposed to 20%, I think, of Green voters. So that kind of tells you something. Or the Sweden Democrats, do you want immigration reduced in Sweden? 99%. 99% of Sweden Democrat voters. This is the absolute, and this is the consensus, I think, in the academic literature, by the way. People who really look at the numbers, the survey numbers, it's very clear. The people who are voting for these parties are voting for them mainly to do with immigration, and immigration attitudes is tied mainly to psychological and cultural factors and not so much to economic factors. Now, that's not to say, now there's two measures. One is, do you want immigration to be reduced a lot, let's say, or increased? That's the attitude to immigration. That's very much tied to your personality, your culture, your ideology. There's a second question, which is, I have a list of 10 issues: healthcare, the pandemic, the economy, unemployment, whatever, and immigration, and we'll have a few other issues, crime, and a few other. How important are these issues? So what happens is when you get an increase in migration, amongst the people who say immigration is fine or we want it increased, there's no change in those people because ideologically they're pro-immigration. But it's the people who say, well, we want immigration restricted. As the numbers go up, immigration goes from their number 5 issue after healthcare and the economy to their number 1 issue or their number 2 issue. And it's that which is what leads to the rise of the populist right. So it's what's called salience, the priority of immigration. It's not the attitude, but the priority rises. There was a study that showed in 9 of 10 West European countries this was the dynamic. And we're seeing this now, I would argue, across many European countries, the increase in the salience. This is partly linked to how much immigration is in the news, which is partly linked to how much illegal immigration there is. But as the salience rises, the populist right rises. And that's what happened in 2014 with the Front National and the Danish People's Party and the UK Independence Party. The UK Independence Party vote was really not about Europe. It was about Europe, but Europe only mattered because of immigration. And actually, non-European immigration was probably the bigger deal than European immigration. It's just that it wasn't acceptable to say that, and so they made it about the European Union. So you had all of these parties get up to close to 30% in 2014, and then in 2015 you had Trump running and eventually winning the Republican primary, and you had Brexit in June of 2016. Brexit, 40% of Brexit voters, immigration is their number 1 issue. This was not about economically left behind people worried about the economics. The economics was a lower priority for them. So that is really what's behind the Brexit vote. And then we have we have Salvini in Italy, and eventually the other pattern we see is that the populist right is no longer just in Italy and maybe Flanders and maybe France and a few other countries where the populist right had already done reasonably well between the late 1980s and the early 2000s. But we also see the populist right now in Spain with Vox, and in Portugal with Chega, and in Sweden, and in Germany, and in Britain. All these places that were seen to be impossible. Like people would say, Britain, it has a first-past-the-post system. It has a tradition of fighting fascism. It'll never vote for these parties. Okay, that's Britain. And then, Germany, they had the Nazis. They'll never vote for them. And, okay, Germany. And Sweden, no. So all one after the other. And also the share of the vote. When Jean-Marie Le Pen won 18% of the vote, there was 1 million people out demonstrating. When Jörg Haider got 27%, around the same time, the EU went to censure them and exclude them. All of a sudden, we're talking now, instead of 18% and 27%, we're talking about Austria almost, in the runoff, it was almost 50%. It was like 48.6. Le Pen might be the president, maybe, I don't know. So the numbers, her last numbers were, I think, 43% compared to 18%. And there was no people out on the streets, there was no nothing, because that tells you how much things have changed. And I think that's very much related to these demographic changes. I should say something about Islam. Islam is a factor, there's no question Islam is a big factor. But it's worth noting that both with the Brexit vote, obviously there's some degree to which the migrant crisis and worries about Islam was playing in the Brexit vote. But also, I would say, if you look at Austria, Haider, they didn't say anything about Islam. Islam wasn't even really an issue. So I actually think it isn't strictly about Islam. It is partly about Islam, but a lot of this is about just declining share of the population. People also not recognizing the society they grew up in. And I should say something also about minorities who vote for the populist right, because that's the other part that we're seeing, part of the equation we're seeing now, particularly with the Hispanic and Asian Trump vote. So one of the things, there's a survey on the Latino and Asian Trump voters, and there was a question, do you agree with this statement? It is important for America to preserve and protect its white Christian heritage. The same percentage of Hispanic and Asian Trump voters agreed with that statement as white Trump voters. Or white people are under attack in America today. The same percentage of Hispanic and Asian Trump voters agreed with that statement as white Trump voters. And why would they say that? Or another stat from Canada, the same percentage of non-white Canadians said there are too many non-whites in the immigration flow as white Canadians saying that. How do we explain this? And it's also very important because the Hispanic particular population has been moving towards the Republican Party in the last few elections. And they look like they're going to be important for if Trump gets in, which the polls look like he's ahead. I'll talk about my book that's coming out in May. So if you go back to the first slide, the main themes in my work are, number one, ethnic majorities. Number two, I'm interested in population shifts and how they affect society and politics. And then number three, I'm interested in the evolution of left liberalism, or of the cultural left. And that's really what this book is about. So if White Shift was about the populist moment, the populist right, and polarization, this is really about woke. This is about understanding woke and where it came from and what it's doing to our politics. And what I would say, by the way, is that I did deal with the cultural left in the rise and fall of Anglo-America. I already mentioned the village modernists, the bohemians, who were saying that ethnicity is great if you're a minority and it's terrible if you're a majority. So that idea of multiculturalism had already emerged in the 1910s. But what woke is I'm arguing this is very much just turning the dial from a 7 or 8 to a 10 or 11 on the scale. And that's how we get to woke. The ideas are not really new. They're just put on steroids, really. Okay, so we'll just look at some trends. For example, this is the New York Times mention of the word sexist and racist between 1970 and 2015. So you just get this explosion starting in around 2012-13, you get this takeoff. And this ended in 2018. I'll show you some more recent numbers. But this phenomenon is what's been called the Great Awakening, the rise, the emergence of woke. Now, what I want to say is this is misleading, I think, because, as I'll show in a minute, this is not exactly the truth. That there was a lot going on back here, just not in the media and not in the New York Times. So now we're taking sexism and racism, these two terms, and I'm tracing them back to 1960 in English language, American English language books. And actually, if we look back to 1960, not in the New York Times, but if we look at all books published in Google Books, late 1960s, we see a spurt. Okay, that is Black Panther movement, Weather Underground, the New Left, 1960s. Late 1980s, early 1990s, political correctness, Afrocentrism, multiculturalism, diversity, all of that, which I lived through. You will be too young to know, all of you except for you, but all these, the politically correct, the term political correctness, which was invented around this time. All the books, the first books attacking political correctness coming out. Speech codes, huge number of these speech codes on American campuses telling you what you're allowed to say and not say. One student newspaper criticized affirmative action and they were shut down. That was already happening in 1990 in this period. So this is not something that's brand new. I remember University of British Columbia, which is in Vancouver, where I'm from, the political science department was shut down because of charges of racism and sexism. No one could point to any individual that was racist or sexist. It was all systemic. And they paid a consultant sort of $250,000 to come in and write this damning report, and there was no evidence, and eventually it made it into the papers, and it was a big joke. But this is just to say that that was already happening in the 1990s. This is this. So I would say, so we then get to the period that you just saw with the New York Times, this Great Awakening, post-2012 thereabouts. That's actually the third. It's not the first. This is the first, there's the second, there's the third. 3 awakenings. And I think that's important because I think what's going on now is related to what happened there. Now, Chris Rufo's book, you may or may not know who Chris Rufo is, but he's written a book where he's talking about America's cultural revolution, and he traces all of the ideas. For example, Black Lives Matter, all of their ideas were largely originated by the Black Power movement of the late 1960s. Antifa, their ideas have largely been lifted from the Weather Underground, terrorist organization in the late 1960s, early 70s. The ideas are not new, but there are a number of reasons why this is at a higher amplitude than that, which we can talk about. And sexism, it's not that this is going through. So if I remove this blue line, this red line would look the same as the blue. It's as dramatic, it's just that there's less attention to sexism than to racism, but still. It's the same pattern. 3 awakenings, late 60s, late 80s, early 90s, and then 2010, 12, 13. In analyses of American religious fundamentalism, or Protestantism, we talk about 2 Great Awakenings. The first Great Awakening, 1725-50, the second Great Awakening, 1810 to about 1840, and then the Pentecostalist awakening of the 1910s. So that you have these periods of religious fervor, religious enthusiasm. And I think we can say the same about a cluster of ideas that I would call cultural socialism. And let me just define what that means. This is a fusion of the left and liberalism. It's like we take the class cartridge out of the console, all right, of socialism, and we stick the identity cartridge in, which we borrowed from the liberals, and we stick that in. That is the ideology. Cultural socialism, it says we want to have equal outcomes, perfect equality between black and white, male and female, for example. We want perfect equality, and then we also want really, really, really strong harm protection. We want to protect minorities from harm, and that includes psychological harm. So that includes, we want to protect them from being offended, because if they're offended, then their self-esteem is harmed, and we can't have that. So it's a hypersensitivity to the feelings, and now you may have heard some of these terms like emotional safety, emotional trauma, microaggressions. That's all referring to this idea of protecting people from psychological harms. That's part of this ideology. So protection from psychological harm plus equal outcomes, which we can do through quotas, affirmative action quotas. So your board of directors must be the same as the population. The billionaires must be the same ethnic composition, gender composition as the population. That is really what we want. So it is a kind of cultural version of socialism, I would argue. And it's taken different forms, and there have been these waves. So you had the late 1960s wave with the New Left and these new social movements. You had the politically correct Afrocentrism, get rid of the Western canon, all of that stuff in the 90s. And then you've had the woke wave now with systemic racism and white privilege and trans and all these other things. Now down here we have another, this is drawn from a paper by a really excellent data analyst called David Rosado, and I think this is an important part of the story. So this solid line here is, that represents academia, basically. The solid lines. And that is the number of times these terms, racist, racism, xenophobia, white supremacy, are mentioned in academic journal articles. The frequency that they're mentioned between 1970 and 2020. So we just catch the tail end of that 1960s first awakening. We get the second one in the 80s and 90s, and then the third one, which is the one we kind of have lived through. That's the academic papers, which is reflecting this down here. This is the books, which is more academic. Then the dotted lines is the media. And actually the media, the mainstream media, was late to the party. What happens actually is that the mainstream media was not that interested in these terms. And then suddenly in the 2010s, they get with the program of what was happening on campus. So that these ideas from the campus just suddenly break out into the media in the 2010s. Those ideas were already there. They'd been there since the 70s and 80s, these radical feminist ideas, the critical race theory, all of it was already common in universities amongst the academics. But it hadn't broken through to the pages of the New York Times and the mainstream media, and then suddenly, there it is, convergence, as the ideas spread off campus. Same with sexism, patriarchy, and homophobia, and all this stuff. Boom. The convergence happens in the 2010s. So all that is the catch-up of the media to academia. These ideas start in academia, and then the media catches up. Okay. And this is another one of Rosado's graphs. This is just looking at a bunch of American outlets on the left and the right. These two sets of terms I would call cultural socialists, the blue and the green dots. So the blue is just prejudice terms like racist, sexist, homophobia, etc., Islamophobia. The green is the social justice terms, diversity and equality, whiteness, colonialism, slavery, gender pronouns, gender neutral, all this stuff. So these start to rise in the 2010s. That's the key moment for the Great Awakening, is the early 2010s. Interestingly, that's before Trump. You know, one of the points made is these are rising before Trump enters on the scene. That's Trump entering onto the scene. So before Trump, Trump probably made a little bit of a difference, and Trump derangement syndrome did make an impact. But, but it wasn't just Trump. And so what was going on there? Well, what's going on is social media, which allows journalists and academics to exchange ideas in a much more intensive way than they had in the past. That's one of the arguments, is that social media allows that. The other thing is the media changes from its money coming from classified advertising, and suddenly its money is coming from clicks online. And in order to generate clicks, you've got a trend on social media, and you've got to get people's emotions up. And so you get the rise of a clickbait model of journalism, and it's pioneered by progressive outlets like BuzzFeed and Vox, and some of these outlets which really are pioneering this opinionated, very progressive cultural left. They're taking those ideas from the campus, they're really ginning up the identity politics, and that leads to this increase. And then now we've got this red line, which is the reaction, the counter-reaction. So wokeness, anti-woke, deplatform, social justice warrior, virtue signaling, all these sorts of counter-reaction terms. Notice there's a delayed effect. These social justice terms increase first, and it's about 4 years delay before the counter-reaction kicks in. And then the counter-reaction kicks in around the time of Trump's election, a little after, and kind of catches up. And now we're into this culture war between the two in the media. And it's not just the US, this is Britain. Exactly the same, almost exactly the same pattern. The rise is maybe a little bit later, like 2014, 15 in terms of the social justice terms. And then the counter-reaction kicking in just a little bit later than that. So that is our pattern in terms of the, there were three great awakenings, I would argue. The late 60s, the late 80s, early 90s, and then the 2010s. Didn't make it off campus until the third great awakening, which is now off campus, and we're starting to see that culture war taking place. Now, it doesn't mean that this is new, because as I mentioned, you can see in academia that these things have an older history. And so even in the 1980s, for example, like in Canada or in the United States, talking about restricting immigration, you could be accused of being a racist for doing that. So there was already a sense in which the term racism had been stretched beyond meaning hating another race or feeling superior to another race. Beyond that traditional meaning of racism, it had been expanded to encompass things where, well, I mean, how can you want immigration reduced? How can you want to prevent immigrants who look different from coming into the country? You can only do that if you're a racist. Well, actually, not really. And this is, of course, one of the keys is to understanding this is the research would show that there's a very big difference between attachment to your group and hatred of the outgroup. Those two dispositions are actually independent dispositions, and they're not correlated. Most of the time, they're not correlated. So if you take a white American and you say, how do you feel towards white Americans on a 0 to 100 thermometer, which with 100 being really warm, 0 being really cold, and then you ask the same about black Americans. Well, a white American who feels really warm towards white people doesn't feel any colder towards black or Hispanic people than a white person who doesn't feel that warm about white people. They're not related. It's a bit like if I really like my family, that doesn't make me hate the family next door. Or if I'm a Chinese American and I want to move in a Chinese area, I'm not doing that because I hate white people. And yet, the way the discourse has developed has been, well, if you want to slow down ethnic change in your country, you must be doing that because you're a racist, because you hate or fear or are scared of minorities. But actually, as the consensus psychological research would show, in fact, it's got nothing to do with that, generally. Not for everybody, but for most people, if you just want to preserve the way of life or the culture or the ethnic composition you knew growing up, that's driven by a different set of motives than the motive of hating and fearing the other. And yet, those two things are always pushed together into the same thing. Well, you're either open or you're closed, and if you want less, then you must be closed, and you're a xenophobe and a bigot. That's the way, this very black and white way of viewing the world that the progressive left has managed to push that narrative. But of course, that narrative was already happening in the 1980s, well before this. And so I would argue that, in fact, already the definition of racism had really been stretched well beyond its original intended meaning by even the 1960s, by the way, but certainly by the 80s. And so what we see now is, okay, instead of saying you're a racist because you want less immigration, you're now a racist because you go skiing, right? So they're just taking it to the next level. Or you're a racist if you want to marry your own group. You're a racist if you want to marry someone from another group. So they're just taking the definition of racism and stretching it more and more and more. But it had already been stretched, is my point. And also this emotional safety microaggressions stuff to say anybody can make it in the Netherlands is racist because we know there's systemic racism. But that sort of, again, is a stretching of the meaning of racism and a stretching of hypersensitivity. Hypersensitivity and minority sensitivity was already well established in the 1980s and 90s. You already had racial sensitivity training in the 1980s and 90s. So I'm saying that this substructure was already there. It's just that the dial was turned to 7 instead of 10, and it's now at 10. And that's the only difference. It's the same ideas, basically. A few new things like trans, but everything else is pretty similar. Okay, so that is just a little bit about some of the trends. I just want to say a little bit about, it is true, if we take the number of people that have been fired for speech or disinvited from speaking in these 3 US-based data sets, there's a kind of peak 2020, in this case 2021, and then it's kind of come down a little bit. So, and I think there is an agreement that we have seen woke reach a peak in 2020 and 2021 and come down. But, and there's a big but here, is if I were to put money on it, I don't think we're going to see these numbers go back here. I think we're going to see these numbers kind of settling out around here, because that's been the pattern in the last 3 awakenings. That there's a wave of enthusiasm, a peak, it comes down, but it settles in at a higher level than it was prior to the peak. So I think we have not seen the end of cancel culture. And by the way, just comparing numbers here, in the Red Scare McCarthyist era, which is written about constantly in the history books, people getting fired for being communist in the US, for example, there have already been more people fired, more academics fired in the awakening in this period than were fired in the entire period of McCarthyism. So Greg Lukianoff and Ricky Schlott in their recent book say that historians will look back on this the way they look back on the Red Scare. So we're still living through something like a Red Scare. And that's interesting, an interesting historical perspective. Yeah, I could say a lot more. I realize I've kind of been talking for a long time. I just want to say a couple of things in terms of the book. I mean, I talk a lot about essentially what I've said to you is, we had these 3 different waves. We had these ideas break off the campus into the media. What this book really emphasizes, though, is it's not so much the radical left that's of interest. It is the liberal left. It's not the people who want to fire people for speech, but it's the people who don't push back. When the radicals say, we want to fire this person, they get the person fired. It's the liberals who don't speak up. It's the liberals who say, yeah, defund the police. Yeah, I think I'll vote for that. It's not because they're not voting to defund the police because they want to overthrow the society in a revolution. They don't support affirmative action quotas because they want to have a communist society. That's not actually why they're doing it. Now, that's why the BLM leadership is doing it, but it's not why the supporters and even these young idealistic people are marching for BLM. That's not the reason. What they're marching for is really around guilt and empathy, as well as suspicion and fear of the ethnic majority. And it's that mentality, that left liberal mentality, that is important to explain. And I explain it with really the rise of the race taboo. When racism became taboo, and that happened very quickly. Again, I start in the US case because I think that's where all of these trends begin. In the mid-1960s, all of a sudden, it became a taboo to say things that were racist. And people had these statues of black coachmen on their front gates in the middle-class homes, and they repainted those statues white, like just in one summer. So it was this huge change. There was an African-American conservative, Shelby Steele. He wrote a book called White Guilt, which explains it really well. All of a sudden, the moral authority went from white Americans to black Americans. So it used to be that black Americans had to kind of kowtow to the whites. And this guy had lived through, he grew up in the South, so he'd lived through Jim Crow and segregation. And then he said all of a sudden, you could see it in their eyes that they'd lost moral authority, and so they needed to kind of virtue signal. Yeah, I'm not a racist like all these other bad whites, and so I support affirmative action, I support reparations, I support all of these radical things, which are actually radical ideas. And so without understanding that race taboo, and it comes in later in Britain, it's not till the late 70s that taboo comes in. And I don't know as well European continent when that taboo came in. But once you've got the taboo in place, that's a zone of sacredness. So the ordinary rules of scientific logic and the law, due process, equal treatment, none of that stuff applies anymore because it's all about a sacred totem that we just have to bow to. And at the top of the totem pole would be, for example, black people, indigenous people, etc. at the top. The bottom, white males. In the middle, women and trans fighting it out. So we have, so we've got kind of this. We have this sort of oppression points, oppression Olympics type morality, with the sacredness at the top, with race. And once you've got that sacredness, it's like kryptonite. It's a very powerful weapon. You want to stretch it to maybe you stretch the power of the race taboo to sexism, to homophobia, to transphobia. You want to expand it from just saying racist, the N-word to someone's face, to being against immigration, to going skiing or saying anyone can make it in America. So you want to use this very powerful weapon to shut down debate, to defeat your opponent through a guilt trip or an emotional blackmail. Emotional blackmail becomes possible because of the sacredness of this taboo. So a lot of the book then revolves around how this taboo has been used. And that taboo didn't come out of Marcuse and the New Left. It didn't start with the culture, the critical theorists. It starts really with liberals, left liberals. So I put a lot more emphasis on the left liberals than I do on the radicals, cultural Marxists, the way Rufo and James Lindsay do. So that's just a little bit of a summary. I also then, just to conclude really, I then talk about what to do about this phenomenon. And here I'm more with Rufo. Six critical race and gender ideology terms like many genders, patriarchy, white privilege, from an adult in school. So you can actually, I think, by being determined, and I think Ron DeSantis is an example of that, you can use the power of the state to actually depoliticize institutions. And I think that's probably something that needs to happen alongside all of the kind of very vibrant podcasts and content, people like Jordan Peterson and Joe Rogan. That's important. The culture war is very important, but also I think governments have not even begun to explore the kind of tools that they can use to actually bring this under control. And I think actually that is where I think the politics is going to go next. So, for example, the bans on critical race theory in schools, on gender ideology in schools that you're seeing in Florida, I think that's now expanding to more Republican states. And I would think that would be something that could be expanded to a number of countries in Europe. The Tory government in Britain has been relatively weak on this. I think they've done a few things, which I'm happy to talk about, but I think for the most part they've been scared of taking on the educational establishment, taking on the civil service, the deep state. They've been very meek about doing that, and I think that's going to have to change probably, because the young population is being socialized under this new set of values, and they're much less liberal. They don't believe in free speech to anywhere near the same extent as older generations. And I don't think that penny has dropped for a lot of conservative politicians. Okay, that's it for me. Over to you.